Rosa wiped the sweat from her forehead as she pushed her cleaning cart down the long hallway of the Riverside corporate tower. The wheels squeaked slightly, echoing through the quiet building. It was Thursday evening, and most of the office workers had already gone home to their families. But for Rosa, this was when her real workday began. She had been cleaning these offices for almost 3 years now. Every Tuesday and Thursday, she would arrive at 6 in the evening and work until midnight, making sure every desk was spotless, every floor was mopped, and every trash can was emptied. The pay wasn't much, but it was steady work, and in today's economy, steady work was something to be grateful for. Walking beside her, carrying a small backpack covered in cartoon characters, was her 8-year-old daughter Lucy. The little girl's school shoes made soft tapping sounds on the polished marble floor as she tried to keep up with her mother's pace. Lucy had gotten used to spending her evenings in the corporate tower. While other kids her age were at home watching cartoons or playing video games, Lucy would sit quietly in the corner of whatever office her mother was cleaning, working on her homework by the light of the desk lamps. "Mama, my math teacher said I'm getting better at fractions," Lucy whispered. Not wanting her voice to carry too far in the empty building, she had learned early on that they needed to be quiet during work hours. Her mother had explained that some of the important people in the building worked late, and they shouldn't be disturbed. Rosa smiled down at her daughter. "That's wonderful, Mija. You're so smart, smarter than your old mama ever was at your age." She ruffled Lucy's dark hair affectionately. "Maybe someday you'll work in a place like this, but sitting at one of those big desks instead of cleaning them." Lucy looked around at the impressive lobby they were passing through. Huge windows stretched from floor to ceiling, offering a view of the city lights beginning to twinkle in the distance. The marble floors were so shiny she could see her reflection, and crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling like frozen fireworks. Everything about this place spoke of money and power and importance. "Do you think the people who work here are happy?" Lucy asked, adjusting the straps of her backpack. Rosa paused for a moment, considering the question. In her 3 years of working here, she had observed the office workers from a distance. She saw how they rushed around during the day, always talking on their phones, always looking stressed. She saw the empty coffee cups and the takeout containers left on their desks, evidence of meals eaten in hurry. She saw the family photos on their desks, but she also noticed how many of them worked long into the evening, missing dinners and bedtime stories. "I think they have different kinds of worries than we do," Rosa finally answered. "But everyone has something that makes them happy, and everyone has something that makes them sad. Rich or poor, we're all just people trying to do our best." They stepped into the elevator and Rosa pressed the button for the 15th floor. This was their usual routine. They would start at the top of the building and work their way down floor by floor. The 15th floor housed some of the most important executives in the company, and their offices required extra attention to detail. As the elevator climbed, Lucy pulled out a worn notebook and a pencil that had been sharpened so many times it was barely longer than her finger. "I have to finish my reading report tonight," she said. "We're supposed to write about our favorite character in the book. What book are you reading?" Rosa asked, watching the floor numbers light up one by one. "It's about a girl who moves to a new school and has to make new friends. At first nobody likes her because she's different, but then they realize she's actually really nice and smart." Lucy's eyes lit up as she talked about the story. "The girl in the book reminds me of myself sometimes." Rosa felt her heart tighten a little. She knew that Lucy sometimes felt different from her classmates. While other children talked about their family vacations and new toys, Lucy would listen quietly, knowing that such things were luxuries their family couldn't afford. But Lucy never complained. She was mature beyond her years, understanding that her mother worked hard to give her what she needed, even if it wasn't always what she wanted. The elevator dinged softly, and the doors opened to reveal the 15th floor. This floor always felt different from the others. The carpets were thicker, the furniture was more expensive, and even the air seemed to smell cleaner. Rosa had learned that this was where the company's vice presidents and senior managers had their offices. "Remember, stay close and keep your voice down," Rosa reminded Lucy as they stepped out of the elevator. Some of the big bosses work late on Thursdays. They made their way down the hallway, Rosa's cartwheels now muffled by the plush carpeting. Through the glass windows of the offices, they could see the city spreading out below them. From this height, the cars looked like tiny toys, and the people on the sidewalks were just small dots moving slowly through the streets. Lucy had always been fascinated by the view from up here. She would sometimes imagine what it would be like to live so high above everything, looking down on the world like a bird. But she also wondered if the people who worked up here ever felt lonely, so far removed from the life happening down on the street level. As they approached the first office on their cleaning list, Rosa noticed that the lights were still on in several of the executive suites. She could see the glow of computer screens and hear the faint sound of fingers tapping on keyboards. These people really did work late, she thought. Maybe they weren't so different from her after all. They just worked with different tools and different kinds of uniforms. Lucy found her usual spot in the corner of the first office, a comfortable chair where she could spread out her homework without being in the way. She had become an expert at making herself invisible during these evening cleaning sessions. She would sit quietly, doing her schoolwork, occasionally looking up to watch her mother work with the kind of efficiency that only comes from years of experience. Rosa began her routine, emptying the trash cans, dusting the surfaces, and organizing the papers that had been left scattered on the desk. She worked with quiet pride, knowing that when the executives arrived in the morning, they would find their workspace clean and ready for another day of important business. As she worked, Rosa couldn't help but think about her daughter's future. Lucy was smart, much smarter than Rosa had ever been. She was curious about the world, kind to others, and had a natural ability to notice things that adults often missed. Rosa was determined that Lucy would have opportunities that she herself had never had. Every dollar she saved, every extra hour she worked, was an investment in Lucy's future. The evening was just beginning, and they had many more offices to clean before their work was done. But Rosa didn't mind. As long as she had Lucy by her side, chattering quietly about her schoolwork and asking thoughtful questions about the world around them, even the longest workday felt manageable. She had no way of knowing that tonight would be different from all the others, or that her daughter's natural gift for observation would soon prove to be more valuable than any expensive education money could buy. Rosa had finished cleaning 3 offices when she noticed something unusual. The executive suite at the end of the hallway had its lights blazing bright, and she could hear the sound of someone typing aggressively on a keyboard. Occasionally, there would be a frustrated sigh or the sound of papers being shuffled around roughly. "Looks like someone's having a tough night," Rosa whispered to Lucy, who was quietly working on her math problems in the corner of the office they were currently cleaning. Lucy looked up from her homework and tilted her head slightly, listening. She had always been good at picking up on the moods of people around her, even when they were in different rooms. "He sounds angry," she said softly. "Maybe he's stuck on something difficult, like when I can't figure out a word problem." Rosa smiled at her daughter's innocent comparison. Lucy had a way of seeing the world that always amazed her. Where Rosa might see an important businessman having a bad day, Lucy saw someone struggling with a problem, just like she did with her own homework. It was one of the many things that made her daughter special. As they moved closer to the executive suite, Rosa could see a man sitting at an enormous desk covered with papers, folders, and multiple computer screens. His tie was loosened, his hair was messy, and he had the look of someone who had been working for far too long. Empty coffee cups were scattered around his workspace, and Rosa could see the remains of what looked like a very expensive dinner that had barely been touched. The nameplate on his desk read Director of Marketing, and Rosa recognized him as one of the executives she had seen coming and going during her 3 years of working in the building. He was always impeccably dressed, always walking with purpose, and always seemed to look right through the cleaning staff as if they were invisible. Tonight, however, he looked different. He looked human, stressed and tired and overwhelmed, just like anyone else who had bitten off more than they could chew. Rosa knocked gently on the open door. "Excuse me, sir. I'm here to clean your office. Would you like me to come back later?" The man looked up sharply, clearly startled. His eyes were red from staring at the computer screen, and Rosa could see the exhaustion written across his face. "Oh, it's you people," he said, his voice carrying a tone of annoyance. "I suppose you have to do your job. Just try to stay out of my way. I have a presentation that's due first thing tomorrow morning, and I'm nowhere near finished." Rosa nodded politely. "Of course, sir. We'll be as quiet as possible." She began her usual routine, starting with the trash cans around the edges of the room while Lucy settled into a chair by the window with her backpack. But as Rosa worked, she couldn't help but notice how frantically the executive was working. He would type for a few minutes, then delete everything and start over. He would pick up his phone as if to make a call, then put it down again without dialing. Lucy, meanwhile, had pulled out her reading book and was quietly turning pages. But Rosa noticed that her daughter kept glancing up at the executive with a concerned expression. Lucy had always been sensitive to other people's emotions, and it was clear that the man's stress was affecting her. As Rosa moved around the office, emptying wastebaskets and dusting surfaces, she noticed something glinting on the floor beneath the executive's desk. It was a set of keys, probably dropped earlier in the day during all his frantic activity. The keys looked important, with several electronic key cards attached to a heavy metal ring. Rosa was about to point out the keys to the executive when Lucy quietly got up from her chair and walked over to where the keys lay on the floor. The little girl bent down and picked them up carefully, examining them for a moment before walking toward the executive's desk. "Excuse me, sir," Lucy said in her small, polite voice. "I think you dropped these." The executive looked up from his computer screen and his expression immediately darkened. "What are you doing over here?" he snapped. "I told your mother to keep you out of my way." Lucy held out the keys, her small hand trembling slightly at the harsh tone in his voice. "I found these under your desk. I thought you might need them." Instead of thanking her, the executive's face grew even more angry. "Don't touch things that don't belong to you," he shouted, loud enough that his voice echoed through the empty office. What kind of mother brings a child to work and lets her wander around touching other people's property? Rosa felt her face burn with embarrassment and anger, but she kept her voice calm. "I'm sorry, sir. She was just trying to help. She found your keys on the floor." "Help?" The executive laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You people don't help. You clean up messes and stay in the background where you belong. I don't need help from some cleaning lady's kid who probably doesn't even know what these keys are for." Lucy's eyes began to fill with tears, but she continued to hold out the keys. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I just thought you might be looking for them later." The executive snatched the keys from her small hand roughly. "These are master keys to the entire building," he said coldly. "Do you have any idea what kind of trouble I could get in if they went missing? What if you had walked out of here with them? What if your mother decided she wanted to come back after hours and look through confidential files?" "We would never do that," Rosa said firmly, her protective instincts kicking in as she saw her daughter's hurt expression. Lucy was just being helpful. "She's a good girl." "Good girls don't touch things that don't belong to them," the executive shot back. "And good mothers don't bring their children to work in professional environments. This is a place of business, not a daycare center." Lucy stepped backward, bumping into her mother's legs. Rosa could feel her daughter trembling, and it took every ounce of self-control she had not to tell this man exactly what she thought of his behavior. But she needed this job. Lucy needed this job. "You're right, sir," Rosa said quietly, placing her hands protectively on Lucy's shoulders. "We'll finish cleaning and get out of your way." But the executive wasn't finished. He seemed to be using Rosa and Lucy as outlets for all his frustration about his work deadline. "You know what the problem is with people like you?" he continued, his voice growing louder. "You don't understand boundaries. You don't understand your place. You think because you're in this building you can act like you belong here." Lucy looked up at her mother with wide, hurt eyes. Rosa could see that her daughter was trying hard not to cry, and it broke her heart. Lucy had never been spoken to like this before. At school, her teachers praised her for being helpful and considerate. At home, Rosa always thanked her for her thoughtfulness. This was the first time anyone had ever made her feel like kindness was something to be ashamed of. "We understand our place," Rosa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And right now, our place is finishing our work so you can get back to yours." The executive turned back to his computer screen dismissively. "Just keep that kid away from my desk," he muttered. "Some of us have real work to do." As Rosa continued cleaning, she noticed that Lucy had returned to her chair by the window, but she wasn't reading anymore. She was just sitting quietly, staring out at the city lights, her small hands folded in her lap. Every few minutes, Lucy would glance toward the executive, and Rosa could see something in her daughter's expression that she had never seen before. It wasn't just hurt or sadness. It was something else, something that looked almost like worry. Lucy sat by the window, her reading book forgotten in her lap. She couldn't stop thinking about the mean man at the big desk. Her mother had taught her that when people were cruel, it usually meant they were hurting inside. But there was something else bothering her, something she couldn't quite put into words. The air in the office smelled wrong. It wasn't the usual smell of cleaning supplies that followed her mother around, or the coffee and leftover food that executives often left in their offices. This was different. It reminded her of the time their neighbor's car had been leaking something in the parking lot, and her mother had quickly pulled her away, saying the smell wasn't safe to breathe. Lucy had always been sensitive to smells. When she was younger, she could tell when milk was about to go bad before anyone else in the house noticed. She could smell rain coming hours before the clouds appeared. Her mother called it her super nose, and they would joke about it when Lucy would scrunch up her face at something that smelled off. But this wasn't funny. This smell was making her feel uneasy, like something bad was about to happen. She glanced over at the executive, who was still typing furiously at his computer. He kept rubbing his temples and blinking hard like his eyes were bothering him. Every few minutes he would take a deep breath and shake his head, as if trying to clear his thoughts. Lucy looked up at the ceiling and noticed that one of the air vents above the executive's desk seemed to be blowing harder than the others. The papers on his desk were fluttering slightly, and she could see a faint shimmer in the air, like heat waves rising from hot pavement in the summer. Her mother was across the room, carefully wiping down the windows that faced the city. Rosa always took extra time on the executive floors, making sure everything was perfect. She had taught Lucy that their work was important, even if people didn't always treat them like it was. Lucy wanted to tell her mother about the strange smell, but she didn't want to interrupt her work, and she definitely didn't want to say anything in front of the mean executive, who had already made it clear that he didn't want to hear from her. Instead, she quietly got up from her chair and moved closer to where her mother was working. As she walked across the room, the smell got stronger. It was definitely coming from somewhere near the executive's desk area. "Mama," Lucy whispered, tugging gently on Rosa's uniform sleeve. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Rosa looked down at her daughter and immediately noticed the worried expression on Lucy's face. In all her 8 years, Lucy had never been one to complain or make a fuss. If she said something was wrong, Rosa knew to pay attention. "What is it, mija?" Rosa whispered back, setting down her cleaning cloth. "Something smells funny in here," Lucy said quietly, glancing toward the executive to make sure he wasn't listening. "It's making me feel sick." Rosa discreetly sniffed the air. At first, she didn't notice anything unusual. The office smelled like most executive offices, a mixture of leather furniture, expensive cologne, and the faint aroma of gourmet coffee. But as she paid closer attention, following Lucy's gaze toward the desk area, she began to detect something else, something chemical and sharp that didn't belong. "Where do you think it's coming from?" Rosa asked softly. Lucy pointed toward the ceiling above the executive's workspace. "I think it's from that air vent. The one that's blowing really hard." Rosa looked up and saw what her daughter was talking about. One of the air conditioning vents did seem to be working overtime, and now that she was paying attention, she could see that the air coming from it looked slightly different, almost foggy. Before Rosa could say anything else, they heard the executive curse loudly at his computer screen. He was rubbing his eyes now, and when he reached for his coffee cup, his hand seemed unsteady. "Sir?" Rosa said hesitantly. "Are you feeling all right?" The executive looked up at her with irritation. "I'm fine," he snapped. "I just have a headache from staring at these numbers all night. And having people interrupt me every 5 minutes isn't helping." But Lucy could see that he wasn't fine. His face looked pale, and he kept blinking like the lights in the room were too bright. When he turned back to his computer, she noticed that his typing was slower and less accurate than it had been before. "Mama," Lucy whispered urgently, pulling on Rosa's sleeve again. "I think we should leave this room. Something's really wrong with the air." Rosa trusted her daughter's instincts completely. Lucy had never steered her wrong before, and if her sensitive nose was picking up on something dangerous, Rosa wasn't going to ignore it. But she also couldn't just abandon her work without a good reason, especially after the executive had already been so rude to them. She decided to try one more time to warn him. "Sir, my daughter is very sensitive to smells, and she thinks there might be something wrong with your air conditioning system." "Maybe you should call building maintenance." The executive let out an exasperated sigh. Your daughter needs to mind her own business, he said without looking up from his screen. The air conditioning is fine. It's just working hard because I've been running my computer and monitors all day. But as he spoke, his words seemed slightly slurred, like he was having trouble getting his tongue to work properly. He didn't seem to notice, but Lucy and Rosa both heard it clearly. Lucy's eyes widened with alarm. She had seen something like this before, when her elderly neighbor, Mr. Chen, had gotten sick from breathing in fumes from a gas leak in his apartment building. He had acted confused and dizzy right before the paramedics came to take him to the hospital. "Mama, we need to get help," Lucy whispered, her voice more urgent now. "He's getting sick, but he doesn't know it." Rosa looked at the executive again and realized that Lucy was right. His movements were becoming more sluggish, and he kept pressing his palms against his temples as if his head was pounding. Whatever was coming out of that air vent was affecting him, and it was getting worse by the minute. The problem was that the executive had made it clear he didn't want their help, and he had been so rude that Rosa wasn't sure he would listen to them even if they tried to warn him again. But Lucy was right about one thing: they needed to get help. "Stay close to me," Rosa whispered to Lucy. "We're going to step out into the hallway and call for help." But as they started to move toward the door, Lucy noticed something that made her stomach drop. There were 2 other people on this floor tonight. Through the glass walls of the offices, she could see a security guard making his rounds down the hallway, and in another office, she could see someone else working late at their computer. The air vents ran throughout the entire floor. If something was wrong with one of them, it might be wrong with all of them. And if that chemical smell was dangerous enough to make the executive sick, it would affect everyone on this floor the same way. Lucy grabbed her mother's hand tightly. "Mama," she said, her voice barely audible, "I don't think it's just his office. I think the whole floor is in danger." Rosa felt her heart racing as she looked at her daughter's frightened face. Lucy was rarely wrong about these things, and if she said the whole floor was in danger, Rosa believed her completely. But they needed to act fast, and they needed to be smart about it. "Listen to me carefully," Rosa whispered to Lucy, kneeling down so they were at eye level. "We're going to walk out of this office very calmly. Then we're going to call for help. But first I need you to take some deep breaths of the air out in the hallway and tell me if it smells different there." Lucy nodded, her small hand gripping her mother's tightly. As they moved toward the door of the executive's office, Rosa glanced back at the man who had been so cruel to them just minutes earlier. He was now leaning heavily on his desk, his head in his hands. His expensive suit jacket was draped over his chair, and she could see that his white dress shirt was damp with sweat. The moment they stepped into the hallway, Lucy took several deep breaths through her nose. "It's better out here," she said with relief. "Not good, but not as bad as in there." Rosa pulled out her old cell phone and dialed 911. Her hands were shaking as she waited for someone to answer. "1, what's your emergency?" "Hello, this is Rosa Martinez. I'm at the Riverside corporate tower on the 15th floor. I think there's some kind of gas leak in the building. There are people up here getting sick, and my daughter smells something dangerous coming from the air vents. Ma'am, are you and your daughter in immediate danger?" Rosa looked back toward the executive's office. Through the glass wall, she could see him trying to stand up from his chair, but he seemed unsteady on his feet. "I think so. There's a man in here who's getting very sick very fast. He can barely sit up straight. I'm dispatching emergency services to your location right now. Can you safely evacuate the building? There are other people on this floor. I think they might be in danger too, but they don't know it yet." As Rosa was talking to the 911 operator, Lucy tugged on her mother's sleeve and pointed down the hallway. The security guard they had seen earlier was walking toward them, making his regular rounds. But something was wrong with the way he was moving. He was walking slower than usual, and he kept stopping to lean against the wall. "Mama, look," Lucy whispered. Rosa saw the security guard and felt her stomach drop. He was an older man, probably in his 60s, and she had seen him many times during her 3 years of working in the building. He was always friendly, always had a kind word for her and Lucy. Tonight he looked confused and tired, like he couldn't quite figure out where he was supposed to be going. "Sir," Rosa called out to him. "Are you feeling all right?" The security guard looked up at them, and Rosa could see that his eyes weren't focusing properly. "I'm fine," he said, but his words came out slow and thick. "Just feeling a little dizzy. Must be getting old." Rosa covered the phone with her hand and spoke quietly to Lucy. Go back to the elevator and push the button. When it comes, hold the door open, but don't get inside yet. We might need to help people get out of here." Lucy ran toward the elevator as fast as her small legs could carry her. Rosa turned her attention back to the security guard, who was now leaning heavily against the wall. "I think you need to sit down," Rosa said gently, approaching him carefully. "There might be something wrong with the air up here." The security guard looked at her with confusion. "The air? What do you mean?" Before Rosa could answer, they heard a loud crash from inside the executive's office. Through the glass wall, they could see that he had tried to get up from his desk and had knocked over his chair. He was now on his hands and knees on the carpet, looking around as if he couldn't understand how he had gotten there. "Oh no," Rosa breathed into the phone. "The man in the office just collapsed. You need to get people here right now." "Emergency responders are on their way, ma'am. Can you get to the person who collapsed?" Rosa looked at the security guard, who was sliding slowly down the wall to sit on the floor. She looked at Lucy, who was standing by the elevator, her finger pressed firmly on the button to call it up. She looked at the executive's office, where a man who had treated them terribly was now in serious trouble. There was no question about what she had to do. "Lucy, when that elevator comes, get inside and go down to the lobby. Tell the people at the front desk that there's an emergency on the 15th floor. Don't come back up here until the firefighters say it's safe. But Mama, what about you? I have to help these people. They're sick and they can't help themselves right now." Lucy's eyes filled with tears. "I don't want to leave you." "I know, baby, but someone needs to make sure the emergency people know exactly where to find us. You're the only one who can do that job for me. Can you be brave?" Lucy wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and nodded. The elevator dinged and the doors opened. "I'll be brave, Mama. I'll get help." As Lucy disappeared into the elevator, Rosa ran back to the executive's office. The smell was much stronger now, and she could feel it starting to affect her too. Her eyes were beginning to water, and she felt a slight dizziness creeping in. The executive was still on the floor, but he was conscious. He looked up at Rosa with confusion and fear. All the arrogance and rudeness from earlier were gone. He just looked like a scared person who didn't understand what was happening to him. I can't think straight," he mumbled. "Everything's fuzzy." Rosa knelt down beside him, trying to breathe as shallowly as possible. "You're going to be okay. Help is coming. But we need to get you away from that air vent." She helped him crawl toward the door of his office, away from the desk area where the contaminated air was strongest. It was difficult because he was much larger than she was, and the gas was starting to affect her coordination too. Meanwhile, down the hallway, the security guard had slumped completely to the floor. He was still conscious, but his eyes were closed, and his breathing was shallow. Rosa realized with growing panic that she was now the only person on the 15th floor who was still fully alert, and that wouldn't last much longer. The chemical smell was getting stronger by the minute, and she could feel her own strength beginning to fade. She had to make a choice. She could try to get herself to safety, or she could stay and try to help two men who might not survive if left alone. One of those men had been cruel to her daughter just minutes before. But as Rosa looked at his frightened, confused face, she knew there was really no choice at all. She was going to stay and fight to keep all of them alive until help arrived, even if it meant risking her own life to do it. Rosa's vision was starting to blur as she knelt beside the executive on the floor of his office. The chemical smell was so strong now that every breath felt like swallowing fire. But she forced herself to stay focused. She had promised Lucy she would help these people, and she wasn't going to break that promise. The executive looked up at her with eyes that could barely focus. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice so quiet she could barely hear him. I was mean to your little girl. I'm so sorry." Rosa felt tears in her eyes, though she wasn't sure if they were from the toxic air or from hearing the apology. "Don't talk right now," she said gently. "Save your strength. Just try to breathe slowly." From the hallway, she could hear the security guard making soft moaning sounds. He was still alive, but he was getting weaker. Rosa knew she had to do something, but she was feeling dizzy herself now. Her hands were shaking and her thoughts were becoming jumbled. Just when she thought she might not be able to stay conscious much longer, she heard the most beautiful sound in the world. The elevator was dinging, and she could hear multiple sets of heavy footsteps running down the hallway. "Fire department, call out if you can hear us." "Here," Rosa shouted as loudly as she could manage. "In the big office at the end?" "3 people down." Within seconds, firefighters in full protective gear came rushing into the office. They were wearing masks and oxygen tanks, and Rosa had never been so happy to see anyone in her entire life. "Ma'am, we need to get you out of here right now," one of the firefighters said, lifting Rosa to her feet. "This whole floor is contaminated with carbon monoxide from a faulty heating system." Another firefighter was already checking on the executive, while a third went to help the security guard in the hallway. Rosa felt strong arms lifting her, and before she knew it, she was being carried toward the stairwell. "My daughter," Rosa managed to say through her confusion. "Is my daughter safe? The little girl who sent us up here? She's fine. She's downstairs with the paramedics, and she's been asking about you every 30 seconds. As they carried Rosa down the stairs, she could hear radio chatter from the firefighters. The entire heating system for the 15th floor had malfunctioned, and carbon monoxide had been pumping through the air vents for over an hour. If they had arrived just 10 minutes later, all 3 people on that floor would have died. When they reached the lobby, Rosa saw Lucy running toward her, her small face streaked with tears. Mama, are you okay?" Rosa was placed on a stretcher, but she reached out to grab Lucy's hand. "I'm okay, baby. You saved us. You saved everyone." A paramedic placed an oxygen mask over Rosa's face, and she felt her mind beginning to clear as she breathed in the clean air. Through the lobby windows, she could see ambulances with flashing lights, and firefighters were still running in and out of the building. "The little girl is the real hero here," she heard one of the paramedics say to another. "She's the one who smelled the gas leak and got everyone evacuated. If she hadn't noticed it when she did, we would have had 3 bodies to carry out instead of 3 survivors." Lucy climbed up onto the stretcher beside her mother, careful not to disturb any of the medical equipment. "Mama, the nice firefighter told me that you stayed upstairs to help those men even when you were getting sick too. He said you were very brave." Rosa squeezed her daughter's hand. "We were both brave tonight, mija. You trusted your instincts and you got help when we needed it most." As they were talking, Rosa saw the executive being wheeled past them on another stretcher. He was wearing an oxygen mask, but his eyes were open and alert. When he saw Rosa and Lucy, he asked the paramedics to stop for a moment. He pulled his oxygen mask away from his face just long enough to speak. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse but sincere. "Both of you. I don't know why you helped me after the way I treated you, but thank you." Lucy looked at him with the kind of wisdom that seemed too old for her 8 years. "Everyone deserves help when they're in trouble," she said simply. "Even people who are having a bad day and say mean things." The executive's eyes filled with tears. "You're a very special little girl," he said. "And you have a very special mother." Over the next few weeks, Rosa's life changed in ways she never could have imagined. The story of what happened that night spread throughout the company and then throughout the city. News reporters wanted to interview the cleaning lady and her daughter who had saved 3 lives by recognizing a deadly gas leak. But more important than the attention was what the executive did after he recovered from his carbon monoxide poisoning. His name was Robert Chen, and he was actually the son of the elderly neighbor Lucy had mentioned, the one who had gotten sick from gas fumes in his apartment building. That experience had taught Lucy to recognize the signs of dangerous gas exposure, which is why she had been so alert to the smell that night. Robert arranged for Rosa to get a much better job with the company, working in the human resources department during regular daytime hours. Lucy would never again have to spend her evenings in office buildings while her mother cleaned. Instead, she could go to after-school programs and play with children her own age. Robert also set up a college fund for Lucy, ensuring that her natural intelligence and curiosity would have every opportunity to flourish. He often said that meeting Lucy had taught him something important about looking beyond surface appearances and recognizing the value in every person. The building's heating system was completely replaced, and new safety protocols were put in place to prevent anything like that night from ever happening again. The security guard, whose name was Frank Williams, made a full recovery and often joked that he owed his life to the smallest person with the biggest nose for trouble he had ever met. But perhaps the most important change was in Robert himself. He became known throughout the company as someone who treated every employee with respect and kindness, regardless of their position. He never forgot the lesson he learned from a little girl who showed compassion, even to someone who had been cruel to her. Years later, when Lucy graduated from college with honors, Robert was there in the audience cheering as loudly as her mother. In her graduation speech, Lucy talked about the importance of trusting your instincts and helping others, even when it's difficult or scary. She never mentioned that night in the corporate tower directly, but everyone who knew her story understood what she meant when she said, "Sometimes the biggest difference we can make in the world comes from the smallest acts of courage and kindness." Rosa watched her daughter speak with pride swelling in her chest. Lucy had always been special, but that night had shown the whole world what Rosa had known all along. Her daughter had the kind of heart that could see danger before it struck, and more importantly, the kind of spirit that would always choose to help others, no matter what. The little girl who once sat quietly in the corners of office buildings while her mother worked had grown into a young woman who would spend her life making sure that everyone's voice was heard and everyone's safety mattered. And it all started with a set of dropped keys and a nose that could smell trouble before anyone else even knew it was there.